So, my name is John Catone. I'm a psychologist in private practice. I've also been a researcher in psychiatry, neuroscience, psychology, related fields, which is where I get my background in statistics and science and such. And the name of our talk today is Z-score, how a tool in psychology can help us compare apples to oranges in baseball. And first of all, Jason and I would like to thank Bill Simons and Jim Gates and the Hall of Fame for the opportunity to speak here today. As you can imagine, it's quite an honor for us to present on such hallowed grounds, and we hope that our presentation lives up to the standard of excellence that this institution is associated with. Now, if there is a sport in which the statistics of the game are as revered as the game itself, it would certainly be baseball. And as most of you know, debates about baseball statistics go back to the earliest days in which the game was played. Today, one of the most heated debates centers on how to fairly evaluate the statistics of players from the so-called steroid era. To some, the steroid use, small ballparks, and juice baseballs of that period make the statistics of that era incompatible with the statistics of previous eras, where ballparks were expansive, the ball was deader, and nobody was using performance-enhancing drugs. To those in this camp comparing statistics from the steroid era, such as Barry Bonds' 73 home runs in 2001, with statistics of previous eras like Babe Ruth's 60 home runs in 1927, is like comparing apples to oranges again. Beyond that, another heated debate about baseball statistics is one that is older and more familiar in baseball history, which is whether pitchers should ever win the MVP award, and if so, how to evaluate their statistics, their pitching statistics, with the statistics of position players. Here too, it's like comparing apples to oranges when you want to fairly evaluate the statistics of pitchers like Jake Arrieta to those of hitters like Bryce Harper, who won the National League MVP award last year. In both cases, we believe that by converting raw statistics to a standardized statistic used in psychology and other research sciences, a statistic called the Z-score, we can refine these debates and more fairly and accurately compare the apples of baseball to its oranges. Due to the time constraints we have for the presentation today, we won't be able to go into too much detail about the mathematical derivations of the Z-score, but for those who are interested, you can find more detail in our book, which is available on Amazon, and we have some flyers with more information on that. Z-score, how a statistic used in psychology will revolutionize baseball. And obviously, we'll be happy to answer anybody's question that you may have. We have some additional slides in the appendix of our talk that may address some of those questions as well if we have more time. So, if I was to break down to simplest terms what a Z-score actually is, I would say that it is the statistical equivalent of the gold standard or the gold exchange standard, which was once used for currency exchanges. Back in past centuries, when there was a need to compare two currencies that had different values, their values were converted to their worth in gold, and then a fair exchange rate would be able to be established between the two currencies. With Z-scores, it's a similar process. Any variable or measure can be converted to Z-scores, whether it's height, weight, IQ, batting average, ERA, home runs, the price of tea in China, whatever it may be. And when they're converted to Z-scores, they can then be compared directly to each other. Now, what's unique about Z-scores is that they inherently account for the performance of all other individuals in the same comparison group. So, for example, Barry Bonds' Z-score for home runs in 2001 accounts for the home run totals of all other National League players in 2001, which in and of itself controls for any biasing factors that may have been present in that season or any other respective season. But for psychologists like me, and how I got turned on to z-scores was in neuropsychological testing and research. We use standardized statistics like the z-score or percentiles in neuropsychological testing primarily, which is often done, for instance, after someone has a stroke or a traumatic brain injury. They're given a series of cognitive and neuropsychological tests on a host of different measures to see the assessment of their damage. But all of these tests are scored in different ways and use very different metrics, and so there has to be a way to combine all of them together, so convert them essentially to the same metric or the same gold standard, and that's really what the z-score or percentile or any standardized statistics needs to do. So once they are converted to the z-score or percentile, then you're able to compare the scores on these neuropsychological tests more directly to each other. So what the heck is a z-score? Well, again, I don't have enough time to go into too much detail, but for now, what I will say is that when you convert scores of any statistic or any type of raw measure to a z-score, you will always have the average performance or the average score on that measure will convert to a z-score of 0, right in the middle. If you can see right here, okay? So this is the middle of whatever distribution you're talking about, height, weight, home runs, so on and so forth. The average performance will always have a z-score of 0. And then beyond that, individuals who perform higher than the average will have positive z-scores on this side, and individuals who perform worse than the average will have negative z-scores on this side. Now, even though in theory, z-scores can extend to infinity in both positive and negative directions, in practicality in the real world, most z-scores reside within the -2 to +2 range. So, as I alluded to earlier, one of the benefits of converting baseball statistics to z-scores is that it allows you to compare pitching statistics directly to hitting statistics, which is very helpful, for instance, if you want an empirical way to determine whether a given pitcher in a particular season should win the MVP award over a particular hitter. It could also be helpful if you're a general manager and you want to decide which player you should pick in the draft and you're trying to choose between a pitcher or a position player. So last year, as most of you know, Bryce Harper won the National League MVP, but many people, especially those in Chicago, thought that Jake Arrieta should have won. Well, without standardized statistics like z-scores, there would be no empirical way to determine whether Jake Arrieta was more deserving of the award than Bryce Harper. But with z-scores, now we can make more informed, objective assessments about pitching statistics to hitting statistics, so we can determine whether Jake Arrieta's 1.77 ERA is more impressive than Bryce Harper's 42 home runs. So asking you shall receive. So here, what's going on in this slide is that I listed in red below each category the z-score for each respective statistic, which the raw statistics are in blue on top, and then these converted z-scores are in red on the bottom. So we have Jake Arrieta's raw statistics and z-scores up top, and then Bryce Harper's raw statistics and z-scores on the bottom. And then what we did was we computed the average of all of Jake Arrieta's z-scores, and the average for his z-scores in these categories of interest is 2.25. We compared that to the average of Bryce Harper's z-scores for his offensive statistics of note, and we came up with the average of 1.81. And so essentially what this is telling us and what this shows is that Jake Arrieta outperformed National League pitchers to a greater extent than Bryce Harper outperformed National League hitters. And his overall average z-score for all of his statistical categories of interest was higher than Bryce Harper's average z-score for all of his statistical categories of interest. For that reason, we believe that Jake Arrieta was perhaps more deserving of the MVP last year than Bryce Harper, but without the Z-scores, we wouldn't have known that. So now I'm going to give you over to Jason, and then I'll come back for some concluding remarks. And Jason's going to talk a little bit about some of the anomalies at different eras of baseball history that make each era unique as it relates to statistical comparisons.
All right, thank you, John. So as John just mentioned, what I'm going to do is go through the 7 eras that we broke down the game into to help put the statistics that we computed into context. Quick background on myself. I am a television producer in New York City, graduated from SUNY Stony Brook with a BA in Political Science. I'm a longtime Mets fan and an avid caller to WFAN in New York City. So we're going to start with the pre-modern era, 1876. We could really date it back to 1869 when the Cincinnati Red Stockings first came into being. They were Major League Baseball's first pay-per-play organization. But for all intents and purposes, 1876, the birth of the National League and universal rules governing a number of ball clubs. So from the 1870s through the part of the 1880s, we saw 2-man pitcher rotations as being fairly common. An anomaly that exists in this era because of this, we see in 1884, Charlie Radburn had 59 wins for the Providence Rays of the National League. It's a figure that's unfathomable in today's game, 30 max. And we saw those numbers in the 60s and 70s. You don't see that anymore. Yet, among the top 20 pitching Z-scores that we computed, Radburn's 59 wins were not in there. And that's because smaller rotations were very common during this time period. So a number of pitchers were racking up victories in the 30, 40, 50-win category. High win totals were extremely common. Radburn, in fact, had 70-plus starts that season alone, and also in 1884, 8 pitchers won at least 30 games. So yes, the 59 is an impressive number as far as the raw value is concerned, but not that much above the fray. We then move to the dead ball era. We start this in 1901, the birth of the American League. In 1903, the pitching mound was raised to about 15 inches. The balls were heavier, larger, deader, for lack of a better phrase. And also what we saw during this period were gigantic ballparks. Center field distances up and down the northeast, ranging from 490 to upwards of 630 in some cases. Yet in 1919, what we see here is something incredible. Babe Ruth hit 29 home runs. Again, a raw value that compared to today's game is not that impressive, but you have to realize this was 10 times the league average. The league average is about 3.5. Ruth's 29 are even more impressive, believe it or not, because of this, than the 60 home runs he hit 8 years later, because those came during a time of greater offense in what's called the home run era, and I'll get to that in a bit. And you also got to realize that Ruth's 29 came when the average mound height was higher than it had been previously. There's another main caveat to Ruth's 1919 total that I'm going to come back to in a little bit, but for all intents and purposes, we're going to move now to the home run era. Baseball's heyday, as I like to call it. The spitball was banned early in this period in 1947 with the influx of black and Latino players, Jackie and Larry Doby, and these Goliath Stadiums, Pines and Avenue grounds in Boston, Hilltop Park in the New York City boroughs, West Side grounds in Chicago, all started to be phased out and gradually became things. By no means did bandboxes exist like we see today in Philadelphia, for example, but smaller ballparks began to become more of the norm. We did come across a number of anomalies here that I can go over in the Q&A session if you're interested, but for all intents and purposes, we're going to move now to the expansion era. Oh yes, sorry guys. Yes, home run era, as I mentioned, Jackie, Larry Doby, Ted Williams. We saw a number of players who actually lost a good time of their playing careers to service in World War II and Korea. So the expansion era, 1961 to 1975. In 61, we saw the emergence of a number of teams, the LA Angels, the Mets, the Houston Colt 45s, who lived between the Astros, San Diego, KC, etc. We also saw during this period the emergence of the pitcher, not as a player, but as an artist. Sandy Koufax, Bob Gibson, Tom Seaver, Juan Marichal. As a result, after the year of the pitcher in 1968, in 1969, Major League Baseball knew they had to do something to help the offense out. So the rules were changed to boost offense amid the rise of these amazing elite pitchers. The mound was lowered to 10 inches, except notoriously at Dodger Stadium, where it still remains high to this day. And the strike zone was also made significantly smaller. Yet despite these amazing pitching performances, what we saw here was fascinating. In 1968, Denny McLain of the Detroit Tigers had 31 wins, Bob Gibson of the St. Louis Cardinals for 22. Believe it or not, both of these pitchers had Z-scores that were higher than Charlie Radburn's 59 back in the 1880s. That's because two-man rotations were very common in the 1880s, and the number of pitches, as I mentioned, were racking up large win totals. The 31 and 22 that these two put together were far above the league average. In fact, Gibson's ERA in 1968 was 1.12. The league average was 2.86. It's almost 2.5 times higher. Denny McLain's 31 wins, that was more than 2 times higher than, I'm sorry, more than 2% higher, 2 times? 2 times higher, I apologize, than the league average of around 14. So these two pitchers, above and beyond, both won the MVP and Cy Young in both leagues. That's the first and only time that's happened across Major League Baseball's history. Move to the free agency year, 1976 to 1985. Players at this point feeling that they can play for the highest bidder. They're not bound to a certain team based on their contract. Overall, we see the rise of relievers used more frequently. Relief specialists, setup men, Muscasa, trolley fingers, and starters tended to be pulled more early in ball games. Moving on along here, we approach the steroid era, 1986. We started this arguably arbitrarily. That's Jose Canseco's first year in the major leagues. In 1995, the owners want offense. There's a strike, and they're sort of turning a blind eye to a rampant drug use. So as a result, home run RBI totals are exploding throughout both leagues. So what we see on the pitching side is fascinating. Randy Johnson and Pedro Martinez, model examples. They were among only a few pitchers from this era to be listed in our top 20 pitching Z-scores list. Pedro in 1999 had 313 strikeouts. Randy Johnson in 2001, 372 strikeouts. An amazing number of Ks to rack up when players like Barry Bonds and Big Mac and Sammy Sosa were crushing the ball all over the yard. We also want to include Greg Maddux in this discussion because in 1995 he had a whip of .81. Pedro Martinez territory, as we like to call it. And the post-steroid era, or lack thereof, depending on how you want to look at it, 2008 to the present, we start that because Mitchell Report comes out in 2007, really shedding a black, ominous cloud over the game. Continuing that to today, stricter drug testing, honestly, but half-hearted in our professional opinion. And we do see the rise of the pitcher again, and the rate of no-hitters absolutely skyrocketing. So it is similar in a way to the era of the pitcher that we saw in the 1960s. But I want to go back for a second to the home run era, because what we have here is very interesting. So I actually want to pose a question to the audience. Of these three ball players, these three individual years, which single season home run record is the greatest?
Hey.
In 1927. Close. But believe it or not, it's actually Ruth in 1919. While Babe Ruth's 1927 total of 60 got a Z-score of 4.71, his 5.7 Z-score in 1919 was the highest Z-score we calculated in any baseball statistic for the purpose of this project. And that's because, as I mentioned, Ruth's 1919 total came during the dead ball era. Granted, it was towards the end of the dead ball era, but still, 10 times the league average. Ruth in 1927, 60 home runs, an extremely impressive feat, but we have to remember that this came during a period when a number of players were starting to hit home runs because those large ballparks were becoming phased out. Maris in 61, also during the home run era, and Bonds during 2001, 73, a mark that may never be repeated ever again. He had only a Z-score of 3.42, and that's because he was hitting during a period when everyone and their mother was hitting home runs. It was home only around 3 times the league average, the 73, compared to 10 times the league average that Ruth had. So the raw value is significantly less for Ruth. The Z-score blows it out of the water. And again, we look at a number of caveats. The pitcher's mound was higher during the dead ball era. Balls were deader. So Ruth's statistics are truly. And lastly, before I send it over back to John, if we translated Babe Ruth's 5.7 Z-score in 1919 to Bonds in 2001, Barry's hitting 107 home runs. You and I both know there's no human way that's possible. Babe Ruth's 1919 Z-score, the single most impressive that we calculated for this project. So, as this presentation rounds third and heads for home, I'll send it over to you. Thanks, Jason.
So before I get to our concluding thoughts, I just wanted to highlight something, a small but significant point in some of Jason's previous slides, which was that according to our analyses, Babe Ruth's most significant home run season came not when he was a member of the Yankees, but a member of the Red Sox. And that gives me joy, not just because I'm a Red Sox fan, but because I think and I hope that this could help to start to correct the record on Babe Ruth a little bit, because for most of us, when we think about Babe Ruth with the Red Sox, we think about him as a great pitcher. But from here, we can see that his offensive production, at least in 1919, was something that was extraordinary. So, moving on, we are here at the Hall of Fame today, so we will conclude our talk with the Hall of Fame. And I thought that Arthur Schopenhauer's quote was particularly apropos for our concluding statements, especially since we're talking about players playing the steroid era and their worthiness for the Hall of Fame. So, as such, I think the essence of what this institution represents is the ability to achieve fame without sacrificing our honor in the process. So when trying to determine how to use Z-scores to evaluate players for the Hall of Fame, particularly those of the steroid era, we looked at other areas of life where excellence is rewarded. And one organization that stood out to us was Mensa, the Society for People with High IQ. Now, to get into Mensa, an individual must have an IQ that converts to a Z-score of 2.0 or higher on a standardized IQ test. So we looked at this and we thought, well, maybe that would be a good standard to use to evaluate baseball players for the Hall of Fame, particularly baseball players in the steroid era. As such, we propose in our book that in order to control for the artificially inflated offensive statistics of the steroid era, a Hall of Fame caliber performance could be one in which a Z-score of 2.0 or higher is achieved by a player for an important statistical category in a particular season. And perhaps over the course of a career, a player could be considered worthy of the Hall of Fame after at least 7 seasons in which they've achieved the Z-score of 2.0 or higher in an important statistical category. Now, at present, there's really no hard and fast rule about what makes a player worthy of the Hall of Fame, but informally, unofficially, you'll hear people talk about having 5 to 10 seasons of greatness, and so we just sort of looked at 7 seasons between the 5 and 10 as being, a fair and appropriate gauge of that. So, as such, we believe that using Z-scores instead of raw scores to evaluate statistics, especially for players in the steroid era, for their worthiness of the Hall of Fame is perhaps the best compromise for making objective and fair decisions about these players and whether or not they're deserving of the Hall of Fame. With that, I would like to thank you very much for your time and attention, and obviously for the opportunity to speak here today. And we're happy to take any questions that you may have, and I have flyers here for anybody who's interested in either the book or some notes that we talked about in our presentation today. So thank you very much.
thank you to our presenters, and these before call for questions. Let's see, we have one right here.
How does, if you've looked at it, your Z-score assignments compared to a statistic like WAR? I mean, that's what WAR is supposed to do, right? Is
Exactly.
put everybody on the same scale and figure out what their value is. How does this compare?
That's an excellent question. So the thing with WAR, number one, is it's a very complicated statistic to compute. I don't even understand how to compute WAR because, well, it's different for pitchers and for hitters, right? And in many cases, the statistic of WAR is created by, statisticians, maybe Bill James or whoever, sabermetricians, who have a belief that certain statistics are more representative of what it means to win a baseball game, right? So WAR, for those of you who don't know, stands for wins above replacement. Essentially what that means is how many more wins a particular player will yield on a given team relative to the average player. So the creation of WAR as a statistic contains subjective decisions about how you compute WAR. Well, look, anything in research, and I'm a researcher also, research in and of itself is subjective in terms of how we choose to study something, a particular phenomenon. You could be studying the same phenomenon in two different ways and get two different results. So because of the arbitrary nature of which statistics go into the calculation of WAR, there's a lot of subjectivity there. With something like Z-scores, it's much more objective in how the statistic itself is computed, and it's a lot easier to compute and for the average person to understand.
That's only if you're doing one statistic, right? If we're comparing home runs, it's easy. What you did when you compared average
Right.
Z-scores,
Right.
like you were including, for example, strikeouts. Well, some sabermetricians would say there's nothing wrong with the strikeout, an out's an out.
Exactly.
So you're including that as
Right, so
there's some subjectivity in that.
absolutely,
Too, right?
I wouldn't say that there is, right, exactly. So there's arbitrary decisions to be made across the board. Now, the advantage of using something like a Z-score is that, again, you can not only compare hitting statistics to pitching statistics, but once you convert statistics to this gold standard, you can even compare across sports. And in fact, in our book, we actually give Z-scores for athletes in performances in different sports. And, maybe I don't know if I should give away the highest Z-score that we computed. It was actually for Wayne Gretzky's assist total in 1982. He had a Z-score of 7.80, which is so far off the charts, it's unbelievable. So that's another advantage of using Z-scores, that you can compare between sports.
Just Wayne.
Just to piggyback off the previous question, you know exactly where I was going with it. You had Ariana versus Harper.
Yeah, to the back,
Harris. Yeah. I was just curious as to what thought process did you use to choose those specific statistics, and how did you do the comparison in that regard?
So you're right. Again, much of this is arbitrary. I wanted, in the book, we had a whole chapter on pitchers winning the MVP, and again, arbitrary decisions are made based on what we tried to do is include some old school statistics, wins and ERA, and strikeouts with some new school sabermetric statistics like WHIP and OPS. So again, these are arbitrary decisions. Somebody else might come up with a different collection of statistics and come up with different average Z-scores. But Jason and I are both baseball fans. We followed the game for a while. When discussions come up about who's better, these are the statistics that are generally used. But yes, you're right. There are arbitrary decisions.
No, I think you're on to something, because I think you gravitate towards that one number that you find that encompasses a lot of things. I was just curious as to how you arrived at.
Yes,
It's very arbitrary.
exactly. You're right.
Richard.
As you bring up the statistics, Babe Ruth's 1919 seasons, Z-score is plus 5.7. That translates into one chance out of about 5,000, using a Z-score of 1 as one standard deviation, correct? It's about less than 1 part. It's somewhere between 1 part in 10,000 and 1 part in about 4,000. somewhere in there. Then you bring Gretzky's Z-score of -7.4. We're talking about something over a period of 200,000 years. Doesn't there need to be some adjustment when you start to get out to those extremes before you can really say that is the Z-score out there? Because that just doesn't seem
So you're saying that they are too far,
I think the numbers,
they are
I think
outliers?
those numbers are too far out.
Well, essentially, if we were talking about percentiles, because percentiles aren't exactly compatible with z-scores, and there are certain assumptions in terms of normality and the same assumptions that you would use for any inferential statistical analysis. But because we're talking about z-scores and not percentiles, essentially what we're talking about is, yes, how many standard deviations above and below the mean. So it's a much more rudimentary comparison, but yes, to some extent you're right.
If we might, Megan, want to obviously bring Taylor into the discussion, and we also want to bring defense into the discussion. And so this would seem to be an ideal time. What are your thoughts in terms of the applicability of the changes in gloves in terms of Z-score?
Wow, you really throwing it at me, didn't you? I will, as I was saying, I just think that this could change a player's performance ability, which I guess I can translate into some change in their statistics as a whole, which then you could see some changes in Z-score values. I just think that this doesn't have anything almost but positives. Like, I can only see scores going up if you're going to increase performance time. So that's how I guess I would see it being able to translate.
I can answer that. So, first time I came to Hall of Fame, and that Spencer carrying up there, he showed an old baseball glove, a pre-1950 baseball glove, and said that he often shows it to VIP visitors, like MVP players that come to the Hall of Fame, and said, imagine trying to stop linebacker with this. This cartoony, awkward glove that they made pre-1950. And he said that's the main reason why you can safely guess that no one's going to hit over 400 batting average in today's game, is because before you basically had to get in front of the ball, use two hands, and cup that ball to be able to catch it, throw them out at first base. Now, with the advancement in the technology of the gloves, people can dive to the left, dive to the right, stop a line, green grounder, throw them out at first. And that's the main reason that no one's going to get over 400 now, is because the advancement in technology of the glove, the range was hugely increased because of that technology. And that was basically that 1957 where they had the A2000 and that development and the evolution of the glove. Since then, a lot of people say there really hasn't been a breakthrough moment in the evolution of the glove, although some people, and myself included, say like the change to synthetics and some of the advancement of the technology material is going to be a sort of breakthrough, a big development in evolution.
Yours also a glove question.
How does the cost compare with the TLC gloves, say, with all other gloves?